that the network, I think, presenters, reporters thought they could do better than the people based up here. But as general comments, I mean, and this is why I think a good in-depth independent study of this would be very helpful, and not just taking the BBC, but perhaps also to the other broadcasters as well, so you can compare and contrast. But things like, I think too many of the UK government's assertions, and some of the assertions also of some business figures, were reported in a way that wasn't sufficiently challenging. I mean, they were just taken as fact, and you shouldn't report things in the course of a highly charged campaign, an important campaign like the referendum campaign, without putting them under the microscope and challenging them. I think there was too much of a focus, too much of the referendum campaign was presented as being about Alex Salmond. Alex Salmond, in my experience, would be the first person in the room to say, this is not about me, it's about the future of the country. But nevertheless, there was an attempt to depict it as Alex Salmond's campaign and as one man's vision or whatever, or one man's preoccupation. And I think even after 2 years, I mean, because right towards the end of the campaign, I was still being interviewed by people who clearly assumed I was somehow connected to the Scottish Government, or I was part of the SNP or something, and distinctions that I thought had been made and properly clarified 2 years earlier were still clearly cropping up. So in all sorts of ways, I don't think the BBC had a great referendum. I think it would be good for that organisation, and certainly good for its relations with people in Scotland if they're going to rebuild the trust that they need to with a lot of people in Scotland, that an independent, probably not commissioned by the BBC, an independent academic study be done.
To move on then, so there was all this explosion of energy in the campaign and grassroots campaigning, and I think it was very important after the vote for all that energy to go somewhere. So it has gone somewhere, and where do you think about where it's going? I mean, we've had the explosion of what's being called the surge now, people setting up different groups everywhere. There's ideas of referendum cafes or discussion space cafes in the Commonweal and hundreds of things. What do you think about where all this energy is going just now?
I think it's hugely positive and hugely encouraging. I'm not surprised on one level, Michael, because I think people enjoyed the campaign so much and they found it so uplifting. There was definitely going to be a desire to keep things. We've now got such an engaged and energised and politically aware population, and there's a real sense that the people want to keep that going, and that's taking different forms. I mean, there are different new media ventures being proposed and talked about. There are clearly, as you say, the groups that were always going to have a life beyond the referendum and intended that from the start. Groups like Women for Independence and Business for Scotland always had a longer term view of what their role was than just September 18. They always planned to be around post referendum. And I think it's great the way that energy is being taken forward. It almost brings you on, in a way, what have we achieved? I mean, and what do we build on? I think we have an enormous platform to build on now, and I think with Nicola Sturgeon becoming leader of the SNP and of course First Minister, I think she's got a fantastically strong platform on which to build. Initially, on stronger powers, greater powers for the Scottish Parliament. We have to be part of that process. But then at some point, I think, it is very likely there will be another referendum. And I have a very high regard for Nicola. I think she will get the timing of that and the narrative of that right. I wouldn't want to speculate on when it would be, and I think that's a matter for judgment. But it will be when the people of Scotland next want to have an independence referendum, and that remains to be seen when that is.
Well, there was a very interesting poll that came out suggesting that immediately after it, and 60% of people said that they had no problem with another referendum within 10 years.
Well, that's right. It's one of these things. I mean, people on the other side kept trying to pretend that people were tired of the referendum or were bored of the referendum, and yet every time people asked the question, and there was a very, very notable poll some point during the referendum about how proud people were of the way Scotland was going through the referendum process. People on both sides of the debate. And internationally, I mean, since the referendum, I've had time to catch up on a lot of the international coverage that I didn't have time to look at in the heat of the campaign. And there's no doubt, I mean, around the world, and I was particularly looking at some of the American press coverage, people do talk about, this reigniting of democracy and the fantastic level of engagement. And people did look on with a degree of awe and envy at the level of turnout, at the level of participation, at the way in which we as a society, we'd started to talk seriously about what our priorities were, our values, and what we wanted to change. All of this, I just think, is enormously encouraging. And things do move very quickly now. If we were having this conversation exactly 4 years ago, early November 2010, At that point, there was very, very few people thought the SNP would win the 2011 election because the polls were all suggesting that Labour would win. So if 4 years ago you had said that the SNP were not only going to win the 2011 election but have a majority, I think people would have doubted your judgment. And if you then said, within 4 years there'll be an independence referendum, the yes side will get 45% of the vote, and by the way, will win a majority in all 8 of the parliamentary constituencies in Glasgow, people would have thought you were delusional, So things move very, very quickly, as we've discovered in the last 4 years, and there's no reason to suspect things won't continue to move very quickly. We've seen how much has happened in 6 weeks or so since the referendum, almost 7 weeks now, and I think that's likely to carry on. We live in interesting times.
Thanks very much for coming on, Blair. That's been brilliant.
Thanks, Michael. Great pleasure.
So that was the conversation with Blair. I hope you enjoyed that. We've started up the For All That podcast again, so we should have another one of those out soon, and there's always another interview on the way as well. So the only thing remaining is that on this podcast the guest chooses the tune, and Blair chose this one, so I'll speak to you next time.